Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us, everybody, today. Um, I'm Tyler Carey, the Chief Revenue Officer at Westchester Publishing Services. And I'd like to also introduce Jim Milliot, the Vice President and Editorial Director from Publishers Weekly. Say hi, Jim. And before we get started, just to let everybody know, your microphones will be muted during the webinar. And if you have any questions that you'd like to submit for the panelists, you can submit them using the Q&A, not the chat, but the Q&A button towards the bottom of your screen. Just a little quick background. Westchester Publishing Services is a U.S. employee-owned company. It's been in business for over 50 years. We're headquartered here in the U.S. We have offices in the U.K. and India, and we support more than 500 publishers with their editorial, production, and digital needs globally. We also have an education services division, which goes as far upstream as content development, illustration, and the creation of educational content for children and adults. So kind of why we're here today, a little background. At the start of the pandemic, Westchester and Publishers Weekly launched this ongoing series of Publishing Now webinars to talk about factors that were affecting the publishing industry. At that time, the focus was just on what the shape of the industry would look like during the pandemic. So we focused on topics like working from home and navigating the initial challenges related to distribution back in 2020. So 2 years on, the series is continuing, and we're continuing to talk about topics, including a session we had in the spring about the supply chain and selling books. And now this fall, we're happy to introduce this stellar panel who are going to talk about the impacts of sustainability on manufacturing and the industry, the industry as a whole and where we stand right now, as well as considerations around accessibility and how to make content available for everybody. So I'll step back now, and Jim, would you like to introduce our panelists?
Thanks, Tyler. Good to be back. I'm sorry not to be talking about supply chain in depth, but we'll live. As Tyler said, we're going to dive deep into sustainability and accessibility. But before we do that, we're going to have Kristen McLean, who I think a lot of people know from NPD Books. She's the person who can tell us what's all behind BookScan. Kristen is a 25-year publishing industry veteran whose career has spanned many roles, including retail and buying, field sales, marketing, and business development. Kristen works broadly with NPD Books clients to help them figure out what's going on in the industry. So Kristen, can you sort of set, the economic landscape on where publishing is today and, where we're headed for in 2023?
Absolutely. So let me just see if I can get my presentation up. Thanks, Nicole. Okay, so we're going to start today. Can you guys confirm that you guys can see this presentation? Yeah, awesome. Okay. So before we get into the details around accessibility and sustainability, I'm going to talk a little bit just about where we find ourselves here at the end of Q3 2022 on our way to the fourth quarter, and just where the industry is generally at the top line. So most of you guys do know who we are, so I'm not going to linger too long here. We're going to look at some industry data, the majority of which is going to come from BookScan. We're also going to look at some digital data, which comes to us directly from publisher reporting, both on ebooks, and now we have an audio panel. The only thing to really know about this is that our weekly data, which comes through NPD BookScan, is retailer reported from about 16,000 retail locations. All of the people you would expect to be in there are in there. Whereas our digital data is coming, as I said, directly from publishers, and it's a monthly data set, so it lags a little bit, the print data, but it is publisher verified. So if you guys have any methodological questions about where our data comes from, you guys are welcome to just reach out to me anytime. So this first slide is just giving us the 5-year view of the top line of the US book market. The headline here is that we just came off our most historic year for print in the US market in 2021. We were up in 2020 also. So we were 8% up in 2020, 9% up in 2021. So here in 2022, we've dropped down, and we often talk about the negative comps, but really we are still at historic print levels in the US. We're running 14% ahead of 2019. And that most of the super categories in the industry are still above 2019 levels, with the exception of adult nonfiction, which is flat to 2019 right now. But the overall story is that there's still a lot of buying and reading going on. And there are things that have happened during the pandemic that I think have really elevated the industry in a way that we're going to see elevated growth, certainly into 2023 and maybe beyond. In terms of what's in growth actually right now in 2022, this is the super category view ranked by the total unit sales on the left year to date through the beginning of September. And as you can see, adult nonfiction, largest category in the US market, also one of the most diverse categories, and is down to 2021, but flat to 2019. And the only area of growth in the US market right now, true growth, is adult fiction. And the reason that it's up really has a lot to do with Book Talk, which I'm sure people have heard. There's a lot of chatter about it in the press, but basically this is a trend where the platform is really pushing sales, particularly of backlist fiction titles in teen and adult categories, really driven by genre categories largely. So romance would be the #1 category there, but also thrillers, mystery, and horror have all been behind that. And I think the big takeaway here for that is that we just have been in a pattern since certainly the beginning of 2021, once we got through the election cycle, that people were just really ready for a little escapist fiction. And that's been a very strong trend all the way through since January 2021. So we think the outlook for fiction is good. I will say, I think the outlook for adult nonfiction is excellent for Q4 though, because we have some very large titles coming. So I think we're going to see adult nonfiction have maybe even as much as 10 points of recovery this quarter. We'll see. Another really important story has to do with frontlist backlist. We track this really closely. This is a trended share of the frontlist backlist sales mix from 2004 forward. And I think here the key thing to understand is just that frontlist has been taking share from backlist pretty steadily, but that starting at the pandemic, that really accelerated. And we're now we're a little worse than 3-to-1 frontlist to backlist. And in children's books, it's less than 2-to-8 frontlist to backlist. So this is online buying, which tends to favor backlist. This is the closure of bricks and mortar stores where frontlist is often discovered. This has to do with collective buying of classics, which have also really pushed this. There's a lot of factors there, but I think it's really important, and it's I think causing some very deep conversation within the trade part of the industry right now about what is the right investment in frontlist versus backlist in different categories, and we're doing a lot of work to help that conversation with clients. Ebook sales, they're soft. They are down from a real high point in 2020. Ebooks had, in the trade part of the market, had been incrementally losing sales a little bit every year, but 2020, with the arrival of the pandemic, really goosed them. And they are now kind of in a slow glide path down. They're actually now down below 2019 levels for the trade sales, so the traditional part of the market. Audio, on the other hand, digital audio is back in growth again. It was flat during the pandemic, grew going into the pandemic, and then as people didn't travel, didn't commute, didn't go to the gym, they flattened digital audio sales, but now they're on the rise again, up about 10% in the data that we have through the middle part of the year. In this data set that you're looking at, this is our digital audio reporting panel, so it's smaller than the total market. So this is just the print, ebook, and audio share for the publishers who report their audio to us, just so that it's an apples to apples view. And for this publisher group, print is about 65% of their business, 20% going to ebook, and 15% going to audio. The last thing I just want to talk about, which to set up this conversation today, is just this idea that we have definitely emerged from the acute period of the pandemic, and we're in a new normal. And I think that moving forward, some of the data that we're seeing in the industry indicates that it's not return to business as usual. And this is just one example I wanted to bring today to set up this conversation. These are the top 12 growing adult nonfiction categories year to date when I ran this data last week. And so all of these categories are in growth this year. And the column on the right is showing how they are comparing to their 2019 levels. And so what I want to draw your attention to here is that, oh, everything here is in growth. The categories that are in bright blue are elevated against 2019, meaning for one reason or another, they are in more demand now than before the pandemic, whereas the other categories here have not yet met their 19 levels. And I think this has something to say about where the headspace is for the consumer in the United States right now. So the things that are really, I think are really interesting here have to do with things like organizational behavior, social psychology, leadership, things that have to do with going back out into the world and making sense of this new reality that everyone finds themselves in. It's sort of less Dale Carnegie and more Tony Robbins rather. And then the other category here that I think are really interesting are books related to longevity, vaccinations, and aging. So we're seeing in the health and wellness space a move away from things that might be more topical and heading towards things that are way more internal. So I think that also is reflecting the fact that our consumers emerging from the market, emerging into this new reality are just in a really different headspace. And I think we're seeing that in many parts of the market. And I think that concerns about sustainability, concerns about accessibility, concerns about corporate ethics, those are all really important as the consumer is moving into the new economy. Jim asked me to finish just to give you guys my estimation of where I think we're going to end the year this year at the top line of the market. I think that it's increasingly looking like we're going to finish up between 4 and 5% down, which is where we are right now, maybe 4%. I think we're going to have a strong holiday season. It's already started early, and there's going to be a lot of promotions in the stores because of many of the larger retailers have a lot of stock. So it's going to drive a lot of foot traffic. And so I'm pretty bullish on having a pretty good finish this year. And again, that's going to be historic compared to pre-pandemic levels. So that's it for me.
All right, great. Thanks a lot, Kristen. Next, we're going to hear from Bill Kastorf. Bill is principal of Kastorf and Associates, a consulting firm focusing on editorial and production workflows, content modeling, standards, best practices, and accessibility. He is a founding partner of Publishing Technology Partners. He's a member of NISO and is an active member of SSB, BISG, IPTC, and the DAISY Consortium. He's also a recipient of the SSB Distinguished Service Award and the BISG Champion Award. He's a general editor of the Columbia Guide to Digital Publishing Services, and I'm happy to say he's a columnist for Publishers Weekly. So, Bill, it's all yours.
Hi, everybody. I don't have slides, but what I do have is lots of links. So at the end of this session, you'll see that there are links to a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about. And my topic is accessibility, and I want to make a clear distinction because a lot of people confuse access issues with accessibility issues, and they're not actually the same thing. So I'm not going to be talking about open access and et cetera. This is really about the accessibility of your content to everybody, especially people with disabilities, cognitive disabilities, perceptual disabilities, motor disabilities, physical disabilities, et cetera. And I really got good news to convey here because lots and lots of progress has been made in the last few years. I've been passionate about accessibility for, well, at least 20 or 30 years, actually, to tell the truth. But it really hasn't been until the last few years that this has really pretty much hit the mainstream. And in fact, Jim will back me up on this because we had quite an amusing turn of events. One of my columns a few months ago was how publishers can get alt text right. And I thought, yeah, I'm kind of the in the weeds guy. I write on all these kind of technical topics, and I'm not sure that it gets a huge amount of readership. We were just blown away by how many people read that article. I think I had a couple thousand within the first day or two of that article coming out. And what that told me is, wow, it wasn't just about alt text. It was how can you get alt text right? It's well, that sounds like a lot of people want to get alt text right. That's really good news. And so Jim actually asked me to write a subsequent column about that phenomenon. Both of those articles are linked, but I'm also linking to some of the standards that are involved, et cetera. One reason that this has happened is that the standards for accessibility, and I'm talking about not just accessibility of content, but also the systems that deliver content and the websites, et cetera, are all fundamentally based on web standards now. Again, I don't want to get into too much technicality, but oftentimes publishers are asked to provide what's called a VPAT, which is basically an accessibility report that sometimes is part of procurement requirements, et cetera. And basically what a VPAT does is analyzes your website or your content against a standard called WCAG. That is actually how it's pronounced, WCAG from the W3C, and that's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And why that's so important is that that standard is now the standard for accessibility requirements all over the world. So, in the US, the one that we're most familiar with probably is Section 508, which really applies to public sector accessibility. But a couple of years ago, there was what was called the Section 508 refresh, and it basically was designed to align Section 508 requirements with WCAG requirements. So, and in the EU, they've recently published the EU Accessibility Act, which it's actually pretty much a wake-up call to particularly book publishers, because ebooks need to be accessible by 2025, which is right around the corner, or they can't be sold in the EU. So a lot of publishers have kind of gotten on the stick to get their EPUBs accessible. In the UK, there's a distinction between the private sector requirements, where there is a requirement, and it's also based on WCAG. It's called BSI 8878, if you want the specifics. For the private sector, actually that's for the private sector. It's called the Equality Act of 2010. But all of these requirements really come down to the same kind of requirements. And the other thing that is significant is that the technical standards under the hood are the same for your websites and for your EPUBs, your ebooks, because the content in EPUB is HTML content, which is the same as your content in websites. And so lots of the standards and technologies that are used are basically now all the same. So it's gotten to be much easier for publishers. I talk about this subject a lot, and I'm still surprised how few people realize that oftentimes it's not the publishers making the files, it's the vendors like Westchester that are actually making all these EPUBs for the publishers. And that's also a very good development, because many of particularly the leading ones, are now pretty expert in accessibility. So even if the publisher doesn't have the kind of technical capability or technical staff to get their content accessible, very likely the vendor they're using does do that. I've done some accessibility reviews for a publisher where their EPUBs were not very accessible, and it shocked me because I know the vendors that they use, and I know those vendors know how to get it right. And in fact, I used to work for one of them, and so I know them intimately. So I called them up and I said, "Hey, what's going on here? You know how to get this right. Why aren't these right?" And they said, "Oh, we're still producing those EPUBs to the specs that the publisher gave us 10 years ago. And in fact, Bill, you're the one who wrote those specs." It's like, oh shit. But hey, that was 10 years ago. Get with the program here, guys. So one message I want to convey is make sure you're revisiting those specs, and that your vendor isn't just, dutifully producing inaccessible EPUBs for you when they could just as well be making accessible EPUBs. One other topic that I've written and spoken about a lot recently is that it's really important for everybody involved in your editorial and production workflows to be more aware of accessibility and ideally contribute to making the content more accessible. Where that comes up a lot is in the alt text that you need for images, which is why that that PW column got so much attention because it's a missing piece in accessibility for most books right now. And by the way, I should say that there are big differences between different sectors. So higher education is all in on this. Trade, maybe not quite as complete in implementation of accessibility, but move it in the right direction. Scholarly, quite good, and so that's why you'll see statistics like Kristen saying that 20% of trade books are EPUBs. Well, for scholarly books, a lot of scholarly publishers don't make print books anymore, and a lot of higher education publishers don't make print books anymore. So they're all E. But the images are often either insufficiently described or not described at all. And how do you get that right? Well, I'm a big advocate to say it needs to be an iterative process through the production. Certainly for scholarly content where the authors typically furnish the images, they should submit what I call a draft image description. What is this thing supposed to be conveying about, you're putting this image in here for a purpose. Please describe it in that context. Education, particularly in education, oftentimes the creation of the images is contracted out to kind of image graphics professionals, but they have to get some guidance. They can't probably do the image descriptions, and then if only you get the image itself and not what led up to the image, you're not going to get the image description right. So, for example, in scholarly, a lot of the images are created from Excel spreadsheets because they're based on data. Well, don't just give the image to your vendor and say, please write me the good image description. Give them the Excel spreadsheet and they can get the data exactly right. They can say what the numbers actually are in that graph, et cetera. And then finally, one last thing I want to mention is the work done by an organization called Benetech. Some of you may be familiar with Bookshare, which is a service of Benetech's, which provides literally millions of accessible books, both in the US and around the world, usually kind of their technology is white labeled. So basically it's the same in the UK, it's just called something different, for example. But they instituted a program a few years ago called Global Certified Accessible. And the goal there was to certify that a publisher's workflow is in fact able to correctly produce accessible EPUBs for their books. And it's specifically book focused right now. Hasn't gotten into journals, et cetera yet. But it was a little slow to take off for the first couple of years, but it has just gone gangbusters the last few years. And so lots of publishers are now getting certified for getting accessibility right. And I will have to say that one dynamic behind that is peer pressure. For example, the first sector that really got going on this, as I mentioned, is higher education publishing. And the higher ed of the big 5 higher ed publishers, the first one that got certification was Macmillan Learning. And I've got Charles Lapierre is the technical guy that runs the GCA program at Benetech, said to me, Bill, when Macmillan Learning got that certification, all the other big 5 publishers, our phones were ringing off the hooks. They said, we need to get that certification too. What do we need to do? So by this time, most of them have gotten it. All 5 of them are working on it. A couple of them are close and most of them have it. And then the other big news not that long ago was that Simon & Schuster got that certification. And so, whoa, that's a wake up call for the trade publishers. It's like, if they're saying that if you're getting an EPUB from Simon & Schuster, it's probably a good accessible EPUB. Well, now that's real pressure on the other trade publishers to get their act going. I know PRH does a really good job on accessibility as well. They're all working on it. They're all getting there. They're all doing a good job. So we're really in a good space for accessibility. And then the last thing I want to mention is that as a byproduct, in a sense, of that certification program, which is certifying the workflows of publishers. Well, like I mentioned, most of the workflows are done by their vendors. not the publishers themselves. And so there are vendors that are now, I don't think they're actually using the term certified, but they're certainly recommended, or I think they now have turned the corner and they actually do say that they're GCA certified. Westchester is an example of a GCA certified vendor. And there's probably at least half a dozen or more of the main vendors producing EPUBs for folks that are certified at getting it right. So if you're not accessible yet, it's not as big a barrier and as big a challenge as it used to be. I do need to make one final comment, is that the EPUB spec itself is now finally becoming a formal W3C recommendation. It's now going to be EPUB 3.3, and we are publishing that recommendation in 3 components. In the past, it's mostly focused on how to make an EPUB accessible, which is content accessibility. There are now 2 other documents. One is focused on reading systems. So what does a reading system have to do with an accessible EPUB? And the third is EPUB accessibility 1.1, which includes, how do you make an EPUB accessible? And that includes accessibility metadata. So I exhausted my time. So I'll get out of the weeds and answer questions later. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Bill. All right, now we're up to Rachel Martin, who's the Global Director of Sustainability at Elsevier, where she's the driving transformational change in the priority areas of sustainability. Rachel represents Elsevier on several industry sustainability committees and is current chair of the UK Book Industry Communications Green Supply Chain Committee. In 2022, Rachel was co-founder of the Publishing 2030 Accelerator. And tell us what's going on in the world of green publishing. Rachel, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. A great honor to be here. If you have questions on sustainability, do chuck them in the Q&A, and I will promise I will have a 10-minute spiel and then answer any questions on there. I like to always start this because sustainability means different things to different people, and there's a chat functionality, and I'd love to know, if I say sustainability to you, what are you thinking of? Are you thinking about the environment, or you're thinking still on bills, reducing inequalities, people? Are you thinking about inclusion and diversity, or equity? Or are you actually just thinking about sustainability of business models? Because sustainability is incredibly broad and kind of covers all of it. If we go to the next slide. The best definition, I think, for sustainability is really about meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And I like this definition because sustainability is around the long term. I love the presentation at the beginning where we looked at 2019 and we were comparing those dates. And a lot of time, if you're sitting in a business strategy conversation, you're looking at, say, 3 to 5 max years ahead about where your business might be going. And sustainability is really around that long term. The Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by all 193 UN member states back in 2015. They're the roadmap of which we're going to achieve this inclusive, sustainable, and resilient society for both people and planet. And what's interesting about them is that they look very flat right now, is that they're all interconnected. So progress made on one of these SDGs will actually raise and accelerate progress on multiple SDGs. So for example, we need economic policies, SDG number 8, that also consider the environment, right? We can't just be using raw materials left, right, and center. So that will help SDG number 13. But we also need economic policies in our society that's going to help no poverty, quality education, zero hunger. So you get the feeling like these are all interconnected and they're pretty broad, right? No poverty, peace, justice, and strong institutions. I think, having coming out of COVID and all the rest of the crises that are happening right now, these seem incredibly ambitious. So if we go to the next slide. You might be wondering, well, how does that actually relate to our sector and what exactly are we doing? And I think there's 2 big broad buckets that we can think about. The first is being a responsible organization. I think this is also sort of thought about in terms of corporate responsibility. And this is looking at your fair work practices. Who are your suppliers? Do you make sure you have, less you have ethical supply chains, no modern slavery. If you're a global company, you know, who are your suppliers in different countries? It's about diversity and inclusion in the workforce. We've had a lot of focus on that in recent years. And it's about the environmental business practices. This is about the actions that you take in your offices. I'm sitting in Amsterdam right now, at the headquarters of Elsevier, and we've changed our LED lights. I'm sure they'll switch off in just a second as we approach a certain time of the evening. But all of those have certain impacts as well. The second big chunk that we could really move the needle in terms of sustainable development is being catalysts of change. We work in an amazing sector. Promoting those principles behind the goals is super important. And I think there's different ways that we can do it. You know, by default, I come from Elsevier, we're the largest academic publisher. You know, we publish amazing science and research. We were, you know, advocating for COVID and vaccines, and we have this amazing contribution. And that is really important to recognize as well, particularly when we start thinking about the environmental impact. And there's things that you can do as a publisher, right? And you can classify your content. You can use different themes. There was a great project which was initiated a while ago now called the SDG Book Club for children aged between 6 and 12. It was a project that I helped launch, which was a collaboration between the United Nations and the International Publishers Association. And that was looking at getting children's books related to all the different SDGs and creating a recommended reading list. Again, raising everybody's awareness around the needs for sustainable development and to integrate that closely into our quality education, into our, you know, into the parents, into the consumer trends, as we heard earlier. And it's also about organizing projects and collaboration. Super important that some of this has to be happening. That's why I love participating in a lot of the industry forums, is that we need to work together on this. Now that all seems very abstract, I'm aware. So I'm going to take climate. Let's focus it down. You know, you can't achieve all 17 SDGs. So as an organization, you have to focus on at least one. One for us in terms of Elsevier has been the SDG number 13, climate action. And I think it all starts with the Publishers Compact. And this was something that gives you that broad perspective. It was again launched by the IPA, International Publishers Association, and the United Nations in 2020. It's got over 300 signatures, and I'll go into a little bit more details later. But it outlines some really broad and very simple things that you can do. So, you know, having someone like myself advocating within your organization for looking at SDGs, you know, prioritizing one SDGs as we've done with SDG number 13. So it gave you the practical ideas of how do you integrate these very broad, massively ambitious kind of topics into your organization. Then for climate, I like to say that you have to really set the target. Like I said, sustainability is long-term. And, you know, for those on the call who might be going to Frankfurt, setting that final destination to say, hey, we're going to meet in Frankfurt. How we get there, you might be going by plane, I might be going by train, people will be going by car. There's lots of different ways to get to that end destination. And things like making a climate pledge, incredibly important. And they're incredibly important for a couple of different reasons. Many people come to me and they say, how do I start this? I don't know where to start. What's the practical first step? The practical first step is make a pledge, make a commitment. It helps to prioritize and to strategize this within your organization. Bringing it to your CEO or to your board level and having that conversation is incredibly valuable. We signed the Climate Pledge last year. That is an organization sector non-specific pledge to become net zero for all direct and indirect emissions by 2040. The Paris Agreement actually has a deadline or a scenario to 2050. So it's about acceleration of that progress. And in the UK, there was another Publishing Declares manifesto that was launched ahead of COP26, which is the UN's climate change conference that happened in Glasgow last year. And what that did was to, again, galvanize the industry to sign up, make a pledge. And there it was to definitely look at making sure we meet that 2050 deadline, but also to think through some practical aspects as well. And then once you've kind of set that framework, the next really big recommendation I can have is to think about how that embeds in your organization. So I head up our climate action program. We have 3 different buckets here. The first one's responsible business, right? This is our emissions reductions. This is where we're working on supply chain data. We're asking our suppliers to give us what their data is. We're trying to scope out what we're doing. It also means in our organization, making sure we have a sustainability mindset. It's amazing that a lot of your carbon emissions as an organization is affected by how your staff might commute. Do you, for example, offer the option for an electric vehicle as opposed to a diesel vehicle? Do you have facilities to charge that if you were to offer it? All of these kind of questions have to be worked out. We were very fortunate well, we're still in the pandemic to some extent, but we set a business travel target to really curb down our emissions associated with air travel. We worked out within Elsevier that the average Elsevier flyer in 2019 generated about 9 tons of carbon from air travel alone. So we were traveling a lot, which was not so great in terms of the environment. We pledged to reduce that by 50%, which is incredibly ambitious. And we're well on track, thanks to COVID, to keeping that at a very bare minimal. But, you know, when we think about 9 tons by 2030 across your whole lifestyle, so your personal life and your work life, you have to be averaging a carbon emission profile of around 2.5. So we've got a big way to go there, and every action happens. And that's why responsible business is so important. The second one, again, like I said before, is around the content. It's about advancing knowledge and research. Us being able to present Lancet Planetary Health, which is really a 43 indicators that link climate with health, is super important. We can help move the conversation around in certain areas as we know that heat becomes an issue or air pollution becomes an issue, and you can prioritize those topics and champion them. If you're a children's book publisher, you know, making sure that children are aware of climate and to get them to understand what sustainable behaviors are. And the third one's around partnership for action. We can't do this alone. It's absolutely every part, every motion of our value chain, from the time that that tree stands to the time that it's in the consumer's hands and what you do with it post purchase. You know, does that consumer put it directly into the bin? Do they give it to the library? Do they keep it on their bookshelf and sink some carbon for a few years? That all has a major impact. And being able to work through those issues collaboratively is the only way that we can move ahead. And if we go to the next slide, I'm aware that we wanted to get practical. And so my biggest advocation today is to really think of looking at the SDG Publishers Compact, whether you're concerned about the environment, whether you're concerned about accessibility and reducing inequalities, whether you advocate for gender equality, or perhaps you're really passionate about quality education. It's a really great way of taking the first step. Nearly 300 organizations have signed up. The website's at the bottom. It's very easy, but it gives you those 10 concrete steps to think about how you might integrate those SDGs. And if you're not really into the SDGs, the themes behind it, climate and people and equality and sustainability, are all really great topics that to have as a priority within your organization. And the final slide, and I think these will be distributed before, is a whole list of things that you can look at and read afterwards. So the Global Compact, obviously go visit, sign up. The other one is our International Publishers Association Sustainability Development Goals website. Loads of examples of what's happening, both in academia, both in trade, both in education and on publishing associations. So that's great. The UK Publishers Association also just last week launched a UK carbon calculator to help their publishing members calculate their scope 1, scope 2, so their direct location-based emissions. And there's some great climate guides to go and have a look at. Australian Publishers Association has a greening guide. The French Publishing Association's got an environmental charter. There's the Publishing Declares, as I mentioned before. The Green Book Alliance is great. That's a really great supply chain project, which is a collaboration between the US, Canada, and the UK. So go check that out. And of course, the Book Industry Communication Green Supply Chain is another great resource. And I'll stop there. A whirlwind sustainability tour.
Okay, let me catch our breath now, Rachel. So, or you can catch your breath. So in that regard, maybe we'll have the first question go to Bill. And Bill, I think we'll start right at the beginning, sort of from somebody who's asking, what are small steps I can take in my workflow right now to start future-proofing my books for accessibility?
Big question there is whether this questioner is saying that they're producing their content in-house, or are they working with a vendor to do the work. It sounds from the question as if they're interested in working on the accessibility directly. I would say, and this actually helps answer one of the other questions that I saw in the chat, which is about how do you assess whether you're getting it right, and is there a service that provides that? There are lots of them. That's one of the services I provide as a consultant, but there are a lot of organizations that will do that. But what I would really recommend is if you're a book publisher and you're talking about ebooks, the DAISY Consortium provides a free tool called ACE by DAISY that is just spectacularly useful for analyzing an EPUB and reporting any accessibility issues and telling you what you need to do to fix them, et cetera. So if you're doing in-house production, that's the way to go. And whether you're working in-house or with a vendor, another way to go, and again, I'm speaking to what I think is a book-centric audience because this is PW and Westchester as sponsors, is consider pursuing the GCA certification from Benetech, because that actually provides consultancy and guidance in terms of, they will analyze representative set of your books and give you feedback and say, here's what you need to do to make these more accessible. And it's very authoritative, et cetera. So those are both very good resources. And then finally, anything from the DAISY Consortium is going to be first rate. So they publish what's called the inclusive publishing, blanking on the exact name of it, but it's a web resource that I noticed Charles is one of the people participating because he was in the chat. He can put in the chat the correct name of that, but it's referenced by ACE by DAISY out, and it's basically gives you clear, plain English, easy to understand explanations of what the requirements are, how to fix them. It gives you code examples. It gives you links to useful resources, et cetera. So lots of help out there.
And Bill, you mentioned some EU regulations coming down the pike. I think you said in 2025. Are there anything in the United States, either at the federal or state levels, in regard to accessibility that publishers should be aware of? You're muted, Bill. Bill.
Sorry. What's interesting there is that people are often talking about legal requirements, and for publishers, it's often their customers that have the legal exposure. So, for example, in education, it's the universities that can get sued if they don't provide accessible content to students that need accessible content. So they put pressure back on their suppliers and in their procurement for the publishers to create the accessible content in the first place. And that's typically Section 508. ADA is often referenced, but there aren't a lot of specifics about how to get accessible. That's why this EPUB Accessibility 1.1 document and recommendation from the W3C is so important, because that actually tells you how to do it. What does it mean to be an accessible ebook?
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, Rachel. So I think a couple of questions here addressing sustainability, reaching climate goals in the post-pandemic era, sort of. So how are you finding sustainable suppliers, diverse suppliers now? How are you verifying their certifications and making sure they are up to date?
So with suppliers, I think it's a massive learning curve. So we've had a diversity sort of supplier program in place now for a couple of years, where we've worked with our current suppliers to make sure that they were using ethical supply chains, but also to fulfill the diversity requirements of the company. We've now sort of transitioned over to understanding, okay, can you supply some information about your carbon footprints? So we want to know their location-based emissions. And we've just started doing supplier engagement days. That's a really great idea to, one, start the conversation, because everybody's at different stages. We've got some suppliers which can give you that data, no problems. We've got some suppliers that can give you it as an API. We've got some suppliers who've never heard of it. So you've got that whole range that you need to sort of move towards. So I think over the last, I would say, 18 months, we've been on a data upskilling journey to make sure we understood who our suppliers were. And in some cases, if you're a smaller publisher, it's easier. We have 18,000 suppliers. So we're looking at it from a spend perspective to prioritize. And then we're going through and we're asking them, okay, can you give us some information about that? We're also trying to think about it in a more of a qualitative sense. So great that we have some data from you, if they can supply some data, but we also need to know how mature are they, or how seriously are they thinking about the climate? I think a lot of us, when we're thinking about suppliers, are looking at the cost structure. You know, we want them to stay in a certain cost structure, but now we want them to be inclusive, and we want them to be diverse, and we also want them to be sustainable. And how do you manage all of that? And I think coming up with sort of programs around that is incredibly useful. There's a project started by Calmstone, the same people who do the FFC certification. They have done a supplier, I think for paper mills and for pulp, around asking them for the data. And they're doing a great job of upskilling as well. And that's not just in the UK, that's actually globally. They've just done one webinar, I believe in China, for example. So those sorts of partners enable you to kind of upskill collectively. And then hopefully we can, I think a lot of the industry bodies are very interested in aligning some of those questions that we're asking suppliers, because we're all asking them the same question. You know, can we standardize that? So, you know, you're only having one set of same information that you're supplying rather than multiple ones. So it's a very long-winded answer, but yes, that's sort of how we've approached it.
Okay, and we'll pick up on that. I don't know if this is a difficult question or not, but if you're printing in Asia, specifically China, how can we check on and confirm fair labor practices?
Yes, so they have to look at certifications, of course. And I think you also have to fundamentally accept that that's part of your responsibility. So I think once you kind of say, okay, yes, I'm going to take responsibility for that, then you need to have a program that's going to check that. I mean, the last thing you want to do is be caught out. A lot of these, like the Modern Slavery Act, for example, they have caveats that can really impact your reputation, right? So if you say, okay, yeah, I support the SDGs, or yes, I'm going to, you know, prioritize climate action, and then you find out that actually you have this weak or a blind spot there, it's not going to really work. So you do have to, yeah, there's no easy answer to that. Industry associations, I think, can help. There's a couple of projects that I'm aware of, for example, looking at the industry association certifications across the supply chain. And I think that's due out before the end of this year. I think that'll be a really great starting point to be able to assess those various certifications to see, okay, what do they mean? What does it actually, you know, prove? And should I be looking at that in terms of my suppliers? So I think it's in the works, but there's nothing definitive. I think it's an individual basis at the moment.
And for Elsevier being a global company, are you in your manufacturing and printing places, are you trying to make it more local instead of having to depend on China, for instance?
Yeah, indeed. And I think additionally with the paper crisis and everything else that's going on, you do have that idea that local sometimes is better sometimes. We're in a bit of a luxury position. Of course, we're a large academic publisher. We have a big journals portfolio, which tends to be quite digital. But funnily enough, it tends to be quite digital, but the biggest carbon footprint that we have is still paper, even with journals and books. So we're kind of working through what that means. We're experimenting. Obviously, print on demand is a useful way of sort of cutting down the emissions. And we're working through how you might look at those in an individual title. So similar to BILS and the Benetech certification, where they certify a particular workflow, looking at that as a book title, because there are some different, and I know there's a question in the chat, there are some actual actions that we can do like tomorrow. And then there's some really fundamental, which are quite hard to achieve. So for example, if you're looking at printing, making sure that the wastage and the size and optimizing all of that, the paper thickness, again, all has an impact on the carbon emissions. And then, making sure the printers and papers, our experience when we've engaged with them have been that they are quite advanced. They are very much aware of their energy usage, and they're very much looking at reducing it. So some of those will happen coincidentally as well. So we've got that. And then, we're also thinking about sort of distribution, right? So how do we optimize where we're going? What does that mean? And that's why I think the long-term perspective is really interesting, because if you think about it, we've got to make some decisions at some point where you locate things, what type of suppliers you're going to do. And these ideas of sustainability, particularly both on the human rights kind of aspect and the environmental aspects, all need to be put into head to say, okay, do you have your printing in China and then ship it back? Or, should we do that? And suddenly there's a different non-cost based decision to have. But yeah, that's all to the future, I think, rather than right now.
Well, and then maybe, and sort of, I think tied to that, somebody was asking, how can you explain how sustainability could be a competitive advantage? I think you addressed some of that, but I remember not that long ago, people would promote, we're green, we're lowering our carbon emissions, that sort of thing. Is that, how does that work out?
So I think there's a couple of different things. One, of course, if you're more efficient, you save costs. And so obviously you can, you can do that. So I think that's the basic one. The competitive advantage, I think, with sustainability, and I think Christine kind of touched on it, right, is that there's a market opportunity there. There is new services that will be required when we're thinking about sustainability, whether that be environment or whether that be social, right? So if you think about a publishing house, having a book from a diverse author could sell a lot better than what you might have done previously, or having books which are looking at climate change. I know the data from Nielsen in the UK indicated that at least post-COVID, people are really interested in the whole spectrum of things related to environment. So this was from self-help, but also fiction, but children's books, audio, everyone was like all over the climate. So that's, again, something that could be a competitive advantage. So it's as much on the content side as I think on the operational side as well.
Okay, great. All right, Bill, this one's for you. As a literary agent, how can we make manuscripts more accessible? Because it's usually a Word doc. Ooh, something moved on me. Let's see. Well, I guess, let's see. Sorry, Bill.
You want me to respond to that one?
Yes.
Yeah. I thought you were asking that because it was the topic of my most recent PW column, as a matter of fact. Or it was one aspect of it. But one thing that most people don't realize is that Microsoft Word, which is what the vast majority of manuscripts are authored in Microsoft Word in the first place, even the PDFs have been their Word in the first place, and they've been saved as PDFs. But Microsoft, the current version of Microsoft has accessibility testing built into it. So it's up on the ribbon at the top of the page, or at the top of the screen, I mean. And you should be able to find it. I believe it's under the review tab. And it will basically give you feedback on the accessibility of your Word manuscript, and even guidance on how to make it more accessible. It will even suggest alt text. PowerPoint does the same thing. I think all the Office programs now have this capability. I would not recommend relying on that automated alt text creation, but it's a starting point. So it's actually more possible to get those manuscripts accessible than most people realize.
All right. And then this was in the chat too, for you, Bill. Would it be reasonable to ask for feedback on your company's EPUB specs from the vendor you're working with and making sure they're up to date?
Absolutely, because very likely the vendor knows better than you do how that should be done properly, if you're working with a good reputable vendor. So I used to have my own publishing services firm, and it was a constant struggle with my employees to get them out of this kind of vendor mentality. It's like, well, why are you doing it that way? It says, well, because the customer asked us to do it that way. It's like, but you know, there's a better way to do it. You should talk to them about that. So view your vendor as a partner, not just somebody that you throw content over the transom to, and they throw something back to you, right? Communicating with it, use them as a resource. They're very likely they know a lot about this already.
Right, okay, great. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So Rachel, you touched on this a little bit before, and going back through the whole supply chain, are there ways you can really verify what's happening in the different stocks of paper and that sort of thing? I mean, I guess, you know, some standards have changed over the time of the pandemic. What are the best ways to verify, you know, that the materials you're using are coming from a reputable source?
So I think in the FSC certification is probably the most known. So that would be my short answer. I think that just, that there you have, that's probably the most widely known one. Like I said, I mean, at least in our suppliers, they all tend to be quite forward thinking on this, right? Because that's their competitive advantage of making sure that they can certify that. There have been cases, I know in Norway, for example, there was an analysis done by one of the groups to look at whether there was any rainforest fibers in one of the papers, right? So that came out. So, you know, I do think there's probably slips within the net, but yeah, generally speaking, I think the Bookchain project is a good starting point for that. Okay.
And Kristen, one for you, a little out of your usual expertise, but we've talked a lot about printing issues and things like that. What are you hearing about in terms of printing capacity and the availability to, you know, print a couple of surprise bestsellers? What do you see in that vein?
So we're still seeing, I mean, I'm still hearing stories about difficulty in getting into printers. So, but one of the things I think is really different this season than last is that people have had plenty of time to plan ahead. So a lot of the big titles that we are seeing that we know are in the pipeline, there's plenty of printing. You know, the printing was done early and is sufficient. So I feel like we're not completely finished with the printing capacity issue, but it's way more better managed this year than last year. And I do know that there are a lot of companies working on longer term solutions for nearshoring printing, from everybody from companies like HP to other companies that are looking to bringing more printer capacity online in order to be able to improve this over the next few years, because they see it as an opportunity, right? So all the things we've been talking about today are opportunities in the mid to long term, both for the health of the industry and also, you know, for the betterment of the world. I think when we bring some of this capacity back, it's going to be better and more sustainable. So I think it's a kind of a win-win-win all the way around.
Well, you can't do better than end on a win-win-win note. So Tyler, handing it back to you.
All righty. Well, we hope everybody found today's session helpful. We are really grateful for Jim, Rachel, Kristen, and Bill participating today and sharing their expertise. There's a whole bunch of goodies that are going to be en route to today's attendees, including a recording of today's session. So if any of your colleagues signed up and missed it, don't worry, they'll get a YouTube video, as will you. PW is going to be doing a write-up, white paper like they usually do after these joint webinars that we co-host, and a copy of the presentation and all the links that Rachel shared and Bill referenced, and Kristen's slides will also be shared after the fact with everybody. So you have those for reference and to share them around with your colleagues at work. If there are any questions that were not addressed, we'll do our best to address what we can from the pile that was submitted. And we would really like to know what you'd like to hear about next from Westchester Publishing Services and PW in our next Publishing Now webinar. So feel free to click the link in the presentation when you receive it, or scan this QR code to fill out a brief survey about today's webinar and any future topics you'd like covered. We're very grateful for this opportunity, and we will certainly follow up with you, as I said, with all these links and materials afterwards. If you have any questions for Jim, myself, or any of the panelists, feel free to send them here to tyler.carey@westchesterpubservices.com. Thank you very much, and thanks for joining us today.